The spring sun shone through the stained glass windows of the Vatican, painting rainbow patterns across the marble floors. It was 2 weeks before Easter, and everyone was busy getting ready for the biggest celebration of the year. People rushed around carrying flowers, polishing brass, and hanging decorations in every corner of the massive building. In his private office, Pope Leo XIV sat at his desk, looking over the final program for the Easter Sunday service. At 73, he had a kind face with deep smile lines and bright, clever eyes that missed nothing. Unlike some of his more serious predecessors, he was known for his unexpected sense of humor and his love of music. "Your Holiness," said Father Thomas, knocking gently on the open door. "Sister Angelica is here to discuss the choir arrangements." The Pope smiled and waved them in. Sister Angelica had been directing the Vatican choir for almost 15 years. Small but mighty, with silver-streaked dark hair always perfectly tucked under her veil, she carried her music folders like precious treasures. "Good morning, sister." The Pope greeted her warmly. "How are our angels' voices coming along?" Sister Angelica smiled but couldn't hide the worry in her eyes. "The choir is exceptional this year, Holy Father. Their Ave Maria brought me to tears yesterday during practice." She hesitated, clutching her folder tighter. "But I must express some concerns about our guest performer." The Pope nodded knowingly. "Ah, Edward Voss." "Yes." Sister Angelica chose her words carefully. "His talent is beyond question. His piano skills are perhaps the finest in the world today, but his attitude toward religious institutions has been problematic in the past." Father Thomas cleared his throat. "If I may, Your Holiness, Mr. Voss has made several public comments criticizing the Church. Last year he refused to perform in Madrid Cathedral, saying he wouldn't let his music be trapped in ancient superstition." The Pope listened quietly, his fingers forming a steeple under his chin. When they finished, he stood and walked to the window, looking out at St. Peter's Square, where tourists and pilgrims wandered in the spring sunshine. "Do you know why I invited Edward Voss to play at our most sacred celebration?" he asked. Sister Angelica and Father Thomas exchanged glances. "Because bridges must be built, not walls," the Pope continued without waiting for their answer. "Yes, Mr. Voss has been critical of us. Perhaps he has reason to be, but his music speaks of a soul searching for something beyond himself, even if he doesn't recognize it as faith." He turned back to them with a gentle smile. "Besides, bringing together different worlds is exactly what Easter represents, isn't it? New life from unlikely places?" Sister Angelica nodded slowly, though her worry remained visible. "Of course, Your Holiness. We'll make it work. The choir is prepared to accommodate his unique requirements." "Excellent!" The Pope clapped his hands together. "When does our musical genius arrive?" Father Thomas consulted his tablet. "This afternoon, Holy Father. His flight from Vienna lands at 3:15. We've arranged for a car to bring him directly here for the initial meeting." "Perfect. I look forward to meeting him." The Pope's eyes twinkled with something that might have been mischief. "I suspect Mr. Voss and I may have more in common than he thinks." After Sister Angelica and Father Thomas left, Cardinal Ricci entered with the day's correspondence. A tall man with a serious face that rarely smiled. He had served 3 popes and was known for his strict adherence to tradition. "I see Sister Angelica looked troubled," he remarked, placing several folders on the Pope's desk. "The pianist, I assume." The Pope chuckled. "News travels fast within these ancient walls. These walls have ears, Your Holiness, and everyone is talking about Edward Voss." The Cardinal's disapproval was clear in his voice. "Many feel his presence at Easter Mass is inappropriate. Because he questions our beliefs? Because he challenges us?" The Pope sat back down at his desk. "Isn't that precisely why we should welcome him?" Cardinal Ricci remained unconvinced. "With all respect, Holy Father, Easter isn't the time for experimental outreach. It's our most sacred celebration, which is exactly why it's the perfect time," the Pope replied firmly but kindly. "When better to demonstrate what we truly believe? Christ didn't surround himself with only the faithful and agreeable." The Cardinal knew when a discussion was closed. He nodded respectfully and changed the subject to the day's appointments. Later that afternoon, the grand entrance hall of the Vatican buzzed with unusual energy as staff prepared for the arrival of Edward Voss. Fresh flowers had been arranged on side tables, and several nervous-looking choir members stood in a small group, whispering excitedly. At exactly 4 o'clock, The massive doors opened and Edward Voss strode in. At 46, he had the confident walk of someone who knew his worth in the world. His dark hair showed touches of gray at the temples and his expensive suit looked slightly rumpled from travel. He carried no luggage, his assistants followed behind with that, but he did hold a worn leather folder that clearly contained music. Sister Angelica stepped forward. "Welcome to the Vatican, Mr. Voss. I'm Sister Maria Angelica, director of the choir. We're honored to have you join our Easter celebration." Voss gave a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "The honor is mutual, sister. Though I must admit, when I received the invitation, I was surprised." He glanced around at the religious artwork and symbols surrounding them. "This isn't my usual venue." "That's precisely why His Holiness was eager to include you," she replied smoothly. "He believes music transcends our differences." Voss raised an eyebrow. "An unexpected perspective from the Vatican. I look forward to meeting this progressive pope of yours." There was a hint of challenge in his voice. A young priest approached nervously. "Mr. Voss, your rooms are ready whenever you wish to refresh after your journey. We've scheduled the first rehearsal with the choir for tomorrow morning at 9. 9? Voss frowned. "I don't perform before noon, and I certainly don't rehearse before then. My contract specifically mentions this." His tone had cooled considerably. The priest looked flustered. I apologize, but the choir has a very tight schedule with all the Holy Week preparations." Sister Angelica stepped in smoothly. "We can adjust, Mr. Voss. Perhaps we could begin with the sections that don't require your presence, and you could join us at, shall we say 1 o'clock? Voss considered this, then nodded. That would be acceptable. Just then, Father Thomas hurried into the hall. "Mr. Voss, welcome. His Holiness would like to greet you personally if you're not too tired from your journey." This clearly surprised Voss. "The Pope wants to see me now? I wasn't expecting an audience until later in the week. Pope Leo XIV isn't one for unnecessary formality," Father Thomas explained with a smile. "He's quite eager to meet you." Voss straightened his tie and smoothed his jacket. "Well then, I wouldn't want to disappoint the Holy Father." They walked through grand corridors lined with priceless artwork and ancient tapestries. Voss, despite his affected nonchalance, couldn't help but look impressed at the beauty surrounding them. "You know," Father Thomas said conversationally as they walked, "His Holiness is quite the music lover. He plays piano himself." Voss gave a small, somewhat condescending smile. "Does he? How charming." "He studied at the Rome Conservatory before entering the priesthood," Father Thomas continued, pretending not to notice the pianist's tone. "He particularly admires your interpretation of Liszt." This information seemed to catch Voss off guard. "Really? That's an unexpected." They arrived at a surprisingly modest door where a Swiss guard stood at attention. After a quick knock and response from within, Father Thomas opened the door and announced, "Your Holiness, Mr. Edward Voss has arrived." The Pope's office was not what Voss had expected. Instead of imposing grandeur, it was a comfortable room with bookshelves, a simple desk, and large windows overlooking the gardens. Pope Leo XIV rose from his chair with a warm smile and extended his hand. "Mr. Voss, what a pleasure to finally meet you. Your recording of Rachmaninoff's Third kept me company during many late nights working on my encyclicals." Voss shook the Pope's hand, momentarily thrown off balance by this friendly, informal greeting. "Thank you, Your Holiness. I'm honored you appreciate my work. Please sit." The Pope gestured to a comfortable chair across from his desk. "Would you like some tea? Or perhaps something stronger after your flight?" "Tea would be fine, thank you," Voss replied, still looking slightly bewildered by this reception. As Father Thomas left to arrange the tea, the Pope leaned forward with genuine interest. "I must confess, I've been following your career since your breakthrough performance in London 12 years ago. Your evolution as an artist has been fascinating to witness." Voss couldn't help but look pleased. "You surprise me, Holy Father. I wouldn't have thought my music would find such an attentive ear in the Vatican." The Pope laughed. "The Vatican contains multitudes, Mr. Voss, just as your music does." He reached into a drawer and pulled out an old vinyl record. "Look what I still have. Your very first recording, the Beethoven sonatas. I prefer it to the digital remaster, though perhaps that makes me a sentimental old man." Voss stared at the record, clearly touched despite himself. "You actually have that? Most people don't even remember it was released on vinyl. The raw emotion you captured in the Appassionata, extraordinary." The Pope shook his head in admiration. "Which is why I was so determined to have you play for our Easter celebration. Music like yours speaks to the soul in ways sermons often cannot." Voss shifted in his seat, his usual armor of cool detachment showing cracks. "I should be honest, Your Holiness. I accepted this invitation partly out of curiosity and partly, I'll admit, for the publicity." "I don't share your faith, I'm aware," the Pope replied calmly, "and that's perfectly fine." "It is?" Voss couldn't hide his surprise. "Of course. Faith cannot be forced. It must be found in one's own time, in one's own way." The Pope smiled gently. "Or not at all. That too is a valid path." A knock at the door announced the arrival of tea. As Father Thomas arranged the tray between them, Voss studied the Pope with new interest. "So," the Pope continued after taking a sip of his tea, "I was hoping you might consider adding one piece to your program. It's a lesser-known work by Liszt written during his time at the Vatican." Voss raised an eyebrow. "Liszt wrote music while at the Vatican?" "Oh yes. Not many people remember he took minor orders in his later years. The piece I'm thinking of bridges his virtuoso past and spiritual present beautifully." The Pope's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. "I think it would complement your original composition wonderfully." As they discussed music, Voss gradually relaxed. By the time he left the Pope's office an hour later, he was animated and engaged in a way Sister Angelica had not expected to see. "How was your meeting?" she asked carefully as she escorted him to his quarters. Voss was quiet for a moment. "Not what I expected," he finally said. Then, with a hint of his usual confidence returning, he added, "But the real test will be tomorrow's rehearsal. I have very specific requirements for the choir's performance with my composition." Sister Angelica's smile became slightly fixed. "Of course. We look forward to working with you." As evening fell over the Vatican, lights glowed warmly in the windows. In the choir practice room, several members stayed late, nervously going over the music for tomorrow. In his quarters, Edward Voss sat at a desk, making notes on his score, occasionally glancing at a piece of music the Pope had given him, the forgotten Liszt composition. And in his private chapel, Pope Leo XIV knelt in prayer, a small smile on his face as he thought about the unexpected connections that could be formed when different worlds collided. Easter was, after all, a time of new beginnings. The morning sun had barely touched the tops of the Vatican buildings when Sister Angelica arrived at the choir practice room. She always came early on rehearsal days, finding peace in the quiet moments before the space filled with voices. Today, however, she felt anything but peaceful. She spread sheet music across the piano, checking each piece carefully. Everything had to be perfect for today's rehearsal. Edward Voss wasn't known for his patience with musicians he considered unprepared. "You're here early," said a voice from the doorway. Father Thomas stood there holding 2 cups of coffee. Sister Angelica accepted one gratefully. "I couldn't sleep. I kept having nightmares about Mr. Voss storming out of the Vatican, telling the press we're all musical barbarians." Father Thomas chuckled. "After his meeting with the Holy Father yesterday, I think that's less likely to happen." They spoke for nearly 2 hours. "About music?" "Mostly, but the Pope has a way of weaving deeper meaning into any conversation." Father Thomas sipped his coffee. "How's the choir feeling about working with him?" Sister Angelica sighed. "Terrified and thrilled in equal measure. Half of them have his recordings on their phones. The other half are afraid he'll make them cry." By 11 o'clock, the practice room buzzed with nervous energy as 30 choir members arranged themselves on risers. They wore regular clothes today. Their formal robes would come later, but they stood with perfect posture. Music folders held exactly as Sister Angelica had taught them. "Remember," Sister Angelica said, "Mr. Voss is just a man. A very talented man, yes, but still human. Sing as you always do, from your hearts as well as your training." At precisely 1 o'clock, Edward Voss walked into the room. He'd exchanged yesterday's travel suit for dark slacks and a charcoal sweater that looked casual, but probably cost more than a month of Father Thomas's salary. He carried his worn leather folder and a cup of espresso. "Good afternoon," he said, scanning the choir with critical eyes. "Shall we begin?" Sister Angelica stepped forward. "Welcome, Mr. Voss. We've been practicing your composition for 3 weeks now. Perhaps you'd like to hear what we've prepared before making any adjustments?" Voss raised an eyebrow. "That seems reasonable." He gestured toward the piano. "Who's accompanying today?" A young man stepped forward from the back of the room. "I am, sir. Brother Anthony." Voss looked him over. "Have you performed my music before?" The young monk shook his head. No, sir. But I've studied your recordings extensively. We'll see, Voss said, not unkindly but with clear skepticism. He turned to Sister Angelica. Whenever you're ready. Sister Angelica raised her hands and the choir came to attention. She gave a nod to Brother Anthony, who began the gentle opening chords of Voss's composition, a piece he'd titled Boundaries of Faith. The music started quietly, almost hesitantly, before the sopranos entered with a clear, pure melody. Voss listened with his eyes closed, one finger tapping against his leg. His face revealed nothing as the music built, adding layers of harmony as more voices joined in. The piece grew in complexity, with challenging rhythmic patterns that Sister Angelica had spent hours helping the choir master. 3 minutes in, Voss suddenly held up his hand. Stop, please. The music died away, leaving uncomfortable silence. Sister Angelica's heart sank. The tempo is wrong, Voss said. It's too careful. He walked to the piano, gently moving Brother Anthony aside. Like this. His fingers danced across the keys, taking the same passage they'd just sung but with a slightly faster pace and more dynamic contrast. It should feel like waves, pulling back and then pushing forward. You're singing it like a hymn, Sister Angelica nodded. I see. More movement, less reverence. Exactly. Voss looked surprised at her quick understanding. The piece isn't meant to be solemn. It's questioning, searching. He played another phrase, this time singing the tenor part himself to demonstrate. His voice wasn't particularly beautiful, nothing like the trained voices of the choir, but his musicality was undeniable. He knew exactly where to place the emphasis, how to shape each phrase. Let's try again, Sister Angelica said to the choir. Remember what Mr. Voss just showed us. More movement, more questions in the music. They began again, and this time Voss let them continue further before stopping them. The altos are dragging on the key change. He pointed to the middle section of the choir. You need to be more decisive there. It's a shift, not a drift. A short, gray-haired woman in the alto section spoke up. I'm sorry, Mr. Voss, but we're having trouble hearing our note when the tenors are so strong there. Voss frowned. That's because you're waiting to hear your note instead of knowing it. He played the passage on the piano, isolating their part. It's E-flat. Feel it before you sing it. The rehearsal continued this way for an hour, with Voss stopping them frequently to correct phrasing, dynamics, and tempo. His critiques were direct but not cruel, focused entirely on the music rather than the singers themselves. Slowly, the choir began to relax into his style of working, until they reached the middle section of the piece, where the full choir split into 8 separate parts in a complex interweaving of melodies. No, Voss interrupted, his voice sharp with frustration. This section is the heart of the piece, and you're turning it into musical porridge. He turned to Sister Angelica. Have they not practiced this section? Each voice needs to be distinct while still blending. Right now I can't tell who's singing what. Before Sister Angelica could respond, a door at the back of the room opened, and Pope Leo XIV walked in. Everyone immediately stood straighter, but the Pope waved them back to ease. Please don't let me interrupt, he said cheerfully. I was passing by and heard the music. It sounded wonderful from the hallway. Voss gave a small, tight smile. We're working through some challenges, Your Holiness. All great art requires overcoming challenges, the Pope replied, taking a seat at the back of the room. Please continue as if I weren't here. Voss seemed unsettled by the Pope's presence but turned back to the choir. Let's break this section down by parts. He worked with each section separately, demonstrating what he wanted, occasionally playing corresponding passages on the piano. His frustration remained visible in the tightness around his eyes and the clipped nature of his instructions. When the basses missed an entrance for the 3rd time, he ran a hand through his hair. Perhaps we should take a short break, Sister Angelica suggested. There isn't time for breaks, Voss said. Easter is in less than 2 weeks and this piece is nowhere near performance ready. The Pope stood up. Actually, Mr. Voss, I find that the mind works better with occasional rest. In fact, I was hoping you might join me for a short walk in the gardens. The afternoon light is particularly beautiful this time of year. Voss looked like he wanted to refuse, but nodded stiffly. Of course, Your Holiness, Sister Angelica. Perhaps you could work with the basses and tenors on that troublesome passage while I'm gone, Sister Angelica agreed. and the Pope led Voss out through a side door that opened directly onto a small garden courtyard. The choir collectively exhaled once they were gone. "Is he always like that?" asked one of the younger sopranos. Brother Anthony nodded. "From what I've read, yes. But he's not wrong about the music. That middle section does sound muddy." Sister Angelica tapped her baton against her music stand. "All right, basses and tenors, let's fix this passage before they return." Meanwhile, in the garden, the Pope and Voss walked slowly along a gravel path lined with early spring flowers. Neither spoke for a few minutes, simply enjoying the fresh air and relative quiet. Finally, the Pope broke the silence. "You know, when I was studying piano, my teacher had a saying, 'Music is made in the space between the notes.'" Voss gave a small smile. "Debussy said something similar." "Indeed he did. A wise man." The Pope stopped to look at a flowering bush. "Your composition is quite extraordinary, Mr. Voss. It asks profound questions." "That was my intention," Voss replied. "To question, not to answer." "The best questions rarely have simple answers," the Pope agreed. He turned to face Voss directly. "May I offer an observation? Not about your music, which is beyond reproach, but about your teaching method." Voss looked wary but nodded. "Our choir is not a professional orchestra," the Pope said gently. "They are people of faith who express that faith through music. Their technical skills may not match your usual collaborators, but their hearts are fully invested." Voss frowned. "Art requires precision as well as passion, Your Holiness. I can't lower my standards just because they're not professionals." "I'm not suggesting you lower your standards," the Pope replied. "I'm suggesting you recognize different kinds of excellence. Technical perfection is one kind. Authentic expression is another." They resumed walking, and Voss remained quiet for a long moment. "The middle section is meant to represent doubt," he finally said. "The voices weaving together and pulling apart. It's the sound of certainty unraveling." The Pope nodded. "A feeling many of us know well, even you." Voss couldn't hide his surprise. "Especially those of us who have chosen faith as a life path," the Pope said with a gentle smile. "Doubt is not the opposite of faith, Mr. Voss, it's part of it." He patted Voss's arm. "Perhaps if the choir understood what they were singing about, not just how to sing it, they might perform it better." They returned to find Sister Angelica working intensely with the choir, breaking down the complex middle section into smaller, more manageable parts. The improvement was already noticeable. Voss watched for a moment, then stepped forward. "May I?" he asked Sister Angelica. She nodded and stepped aside. "This section of the music," Voss explained to the choir, "is about doubt. About questions that don't have easy answers. Each voice represents a different question, a different uncertainty." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "When you sing your part, think about something you've questioned deeply, something that matters to you." The choir members exchanged glances, surprised by this new approach. "Let's try it again," Voss said, his tone noticeably gentler than before. Not just the notes this time, but the meaning behind them. Brother Anthony began playing the introduction to the section, and the choir began again. The difference was immediate. Though not technically perfect, the emotional quality of their singing had transformed. Each phrase had direction and purpose now. Voss let them sing the entire section without interruption. When they finished, the room was silent for a moment. "Better," he said simply. "Much better." Sister Angelica caught the Pope's eye and gave a small, grateful nod. He smiled in return before slipping quietly out of the room. The rest of the rehearsal continued with a noticeably different atmosphere. Voss was still exacting in his requirements, still stopped them frequently to correct and adjust, but there was a new respect in his manner. When he demonstrated what he wanted, he explained why, not just how. By the end of the 3-hour session, the choir was exhausted, but energized. They had connected with Voss's music on a deeper level, and it showed in their performance. "Tomorrow," Voss said as they were gathering their things, "I'd like to hear the Liszt piece His Holiness suggested, and—" he hesitated. "I have some thoughts about the traditional Easter hymns as well. If you're open to suggestions." Sister Angelica smiled. "We're always open to good ideas, Mr. Voss." As the choir filed out, talking excitedly among themselves, Sister Angelica noticed Voss lingering at the piano, playing softly to himself. It was a melody she recognized from an old Latin hymn, but he was playing it with subtle variations that made it sound new and intriguing. "That's beautiful," she said. I haven't heard it played quite that way before. Voss looked up, almost embarrassed to be caught. Just experimenting, he said. There's something about this place. It makes me hear things differently. The Vatican has that effect on people, she replied. Even those who don't believe in what it represents. Voss closed the piano lid gently. I believe in music, sister. The rest, I'm still questioning. Questions are welcome here, she said, as long as they're asked with an open heart. As he gathered his music, Voss asked casually, Has Pope Leo always been so unexpected? Sister Angelica laughed. Oh, yes. He keeps everyone on their toes. You should hear some of his homilies. They're not what most people expect from a pope. I'm beginning to see that, Voss said thoughtfully. I wonder what other surprises he has in store. 5 days into rehearsals, the Vatican was buzzing with whispers about Eduard Voss. Kitchen staff traded stories about his demanding coffee orders. Swiss guards noted his late-night walks through the gardens. Choir members had created a secret hand signal to warn each other when he was approaching practice rooms. In the grand hall where the final dress rehearsal would take place, Voss stood with his back to the empty audience seats facing Sister Angelica and Father Thomas. Behind them, workers were setting up chairs and music stands. The acoustics aren't right, Voss said, snapping his fingers and listening to the echo. The piano should be moved forward at least 3 feet. Father Thomas made a note. We can arrange that, and the choir will need to be positioned differently. With the current setup, the sopranos will overpower everyone else in this space. Voss paced the area, looking up at the high ceiling. The basses should be center right, not on the far end. Sister Angelica nodded patiently. She'd grown accustomed to Voss's perfectionism over the past days. I'll adjust the arrangement. And the lighting, Voss began, but was interrupted by a commotion at the entrance. Several people were entering, including Cardinal Ricci and 2 men in expensive suits carrying notebooks. A woman with them held a professional camera. What's this? Voss asked, frowning. Father Thomas hurried over to greet the newcomers. After a brief conversation, he returned, looking uncomfortable. Cardinal Ricci has brought representatives from the Vatican press office. They're doing a feature on the Easter preparations. They'd like to observe today's rehearsal and take some photographs for the article. Voss's expression darkened. Absolutely not. Rehearsals are private. Sister Angelica touched his arm gently. Mr. Voss, the Vatican always documents major events. It's tradition. My contract says nothing about press coverage during preparation, Voss insisted. Not press, Cardinal Ricci corrected, approaching their group. These are Vatican staff who handle our internal communications. The photos will only appear in official publications. Voss crossed his arms. I don't perform for cameras when I'm working. The Cardinal smiled thinly. You're not performing, Mr. Voss. You're rehearsing in preparation for a Vatican ceremony. This building and everything that happens within it belongs to the Church. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Sister Angelica glanced worriedly between the 2 men. Perhaps, came a warm voice from the side entrance, we could compromise. Everyone turned to see Pope Leo XIV walking toward them, dressed in simple white robes rather than formal attire. Your Holiness, Cardinal Ricci said with a slight bow. We didn't expect you this morning. I find myself drawn to the music, the Pope replied with a smile. He turned to Voss. I understand your concerns about privacy during the creative process. What if our communications team observes only the final run-through today? That would give you time to work unobserved while still allowing us to document this historic collaboration. Voss hesitated, clearly caught between his principles and not wanting to refuse the Pope directly. That would be acceptable, he finally said. Excellent. The Pope clapped his hands together. And while they wait, perhaps our communications friends could interview me about why music is so important to our Easter celebration this year. The press team looked delighted at this unexpected opportunity, and Cardinal Ricci had little choice but to escort them out along with the Pope. When they were gone, Voss exhaled sharply. Does he always appear at just the right moment? Sister Angelica laughed. It's a gift. Some call it divine intervention. I call it good timing, Voss muttered, but there was less edge to his voice than there might have been a few days ago. As choir members began filing in, hanging up coats and arranging music folders, Voss returned to the piano. His fingers moved across the keys, not playing fully but sketching fragments of melody, testing how they sounded in the space. Sister Angelica organized the choir according to Voss's new arrangement. placing the basses and tenors more centrally than usual. As they settled into position, Brother Anthony approached Voss with sheet music in hand. "Mr. Voss, I've been working on the accompaniment for the Liszt piece. Would you mind checking if this matches your interpretation?" Voss took the music, scanning the young monk's handwritten notes and markings. "You've added quite a lot here." Brother Anthony looked nervous. "Just some thoughts on dynamics and tempo. I can remove them if—" "No," Voss interrupted, continuing to study the music. "These are good observations, especially this ritardando before the key change." "That's exactly right." He looked up with newfound respect. "You understand Liszt well." Brother Anthony blushed with pleasure. "I wrote my thesis on his religious works. They're often overlooked in favor of his showpieces." "Play the opening for me," Voss said, stepping away from the piano. As Brother Anthony began to play, his nervousness faded away, replaced by confident musicality. The piece was haunting, with a simple melody that evolved into complex harmonies. It wasn't as technically demanding as most of Liszt's famous works, but it had a depth of feeling that filled the hall. Voss listened with his eyes closed. When Brother Anthony finished the first section, Voss nodded. "Good, very good. Let's see how it works with the choir." The morning progressed smoothly, with Voss in a surprisingly collaborative mood. He worked section by section, building the program that would flow through the Easter service. The traditional hymns came first, followed by the Liszt piece, and finally Voss's original composition as the centerpiece. By midday, they were ready for a complete run-through. The press team and several Vatican officials, including Cardinal Ricci, filed in quietly to observe. The Pope took a seat in the back row, almost unnoticed until someone whispered and heads turned. "Ignore them," Voss told the choir. "Sing for the music, not the audience." Sister Angelica raised her hands and the choir began the first hymn. Their voices blended beautifully in the ancient melody, filling the hall with sound that seemed to rise up to the painted ceiling and float there like a cloud. They moved smoothly into the second piece, and then Brother Anthony took his place at the piano for the Liszt composition. As the choir joined in, Voss watched from the side, his expression intent but pleased. Finally, it was time for his own piece. He nodded to Sister Angelica, who gave the starting notes. The choir began softly, building gradually into the complex, questioning harmonies they had worked so hard to perfect. When they reached the middle section, the part about doubt, their voices intertwined with new confidence and understanding. Voss found himself holding his breath as they moved into the final section, where the separate melodies began to find resolution. It was the most difficult part technically, with rapid key changes and challenging intervals. The first hint of trouble came when the altos entered a beat too early, throwing off the tenors. A ripple of uncertainty passed through the choir. Sister Angelica kept her hands steady, trying to guide them back together, but then the sopranos missed a key change entirely. Within moments, the careful structure of the piece began to unravel. Some singers stopped, looking confused, while others pressed on, creating a jumble of competing sounds. Sister Angelica cut them off with a sharp gesture. "Let's take it from the beginning of the final section," she said calmly. But Voss stepped forward, his face tight with disappointment. "What happened?" "We've rehearsed this passage at least 20 times. No one spoke. The choir members looked at their shoes, their music, anywhere but at Voss. "It's the audience," he said, gesturing toward the press and officials. "You're thinking about them instead of the music." An uncomfortable silence filled the hall. "Perhaps," said Cardinal Ricci from his seat, "this piece is simply too ambitious for a church choir." "There's no shame in that, Mr. Voss. Even the most dedicated amateurs have limitations." Voss turned sharply toward the cardinal. "And this has nothing to do with their abilities. They sang it perfectly yesterday." "Yesterday there was no audience," the cardinal replied. "Easter Sunday will have thousands of people, plus television cameras. If they cannot handle a small group of observers, they can handle it," Voss snapped. "They just need to focus." Cardinal Ricci shrugged. "Maybe we should consider a simpler program." The traditional hymns sounded lovely. Voss walked to the edge of the stage, his eyes blazing. "Are you suggesting we cut my composition? The piece your Pope specifically commissioned?" "I'm suggesting," the cardinal said coolly, "that we prioritize what will create a worshipful atmosphere, not what will satisfy artistic egos." A murmur ran through the observers. Someone from the press team whispered something to a companion. Sister Angelica stepped forward, trying to defuse the situation. "I'm sure we can work through this minor setback." "It's not minor," Voss interrupted. "It's fundamental. Either we perform the music as written, with all its complexity and questions, or we don't perform it at all." Cardinal Ricci stood up. "Mr. Voss, with all due respect, this is a religious service, not a concert hall. The music serves the worship, not the other way around." "And who decides what serves worship?" Voss challenged. "Only those who never question? Only those who pretend to have all the answers?" The Cardinal's face flushed. "Watch yourself, Mr. Voss, you are a guest here." "A guest who was invited specifically because I asked difficult questions through my music," Voss retorted. "Or was that just for show? Does the Church only want the appearance of openness while actually remaining closed to anything challenging?" The hall fell completely silent. Even the choir seemed to be holding its collective breath. From the back row, Pope Leo XIV stood up. All heads turned toward him as he walked slowly down the center aisle. "Cardinal Ricci," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "Mr. Voss is right. I invited him precisely because his music asks questions that we sometimes avoid. Easter is not only about answers and certainties, it's also about the journey through doubt and darkness toward light." He reached the front and looked up at the choir. "And you, my friends, have been on a journey of your own these past days, haven't you? Learning to sing not just with your voices but with your hearts and minds." Several choir members nodded, their faces reflecting both the challenge and reward of working with Voss. The Pope turned to Voss. "As for you, my dear maestro, you've discovered something too, I think. That perfection comes in different forms, sometimes in flawless technique, but sometimes in genuine expression, even with flaws." Voss looked away, but not before everyone saw the truth of the Pope's words in his expression. "Now," the Pope continued, addressing everyone, "I believe we were in the middle of a rehearsal. Perhaps our observers could give us a bit more time to work through these challenges. Cardinal, would you be so kind as to escort our friends to the reception room? I've asked the kitchen to prepare some refreshments." The Cardinal clearly wanted to object but couldn't contradict the Pope directly. With a stiff nod, he led the press team out of the hall. When they were gone, the Pope turned back to Voss and Sister Angelica. "Shall we continue? I'd very much like to hear that final section when it all comes together." Sister Angelica smiled gratefully. "Of course, Your Holiness." Voss hesitated, then stepped closer to the choir. "Before we begin again," he said, his voice quieter than usual, "I want to say something. What happened just now? The mistake. It wasn't your fault. It was mine." The choir members exchanged surprised glances. "I've been pushing for technical perfection," Voss continued, "sometimes at the expense of the music's meaning. But this piece isn't about perfection, it's about questioning, searching, and finding your own way through the doubts." He took a deep breath. "So let's try again. But this time, don't worry about hitting every note exactly right. Focus on what the music is saying." He turned to Sister Angelica and nodded. She raised her hands and the choir began again. This time, when they reached the troublesome final section, something magical happened. Though not every note was technically perfect, the music flowed with a new emotional power. The questions in the middle section seemed to find, if not answers, at least a kind of peace in the resolution. When the last note faded away, there was complete silence in the hall. Then the Pope began to applaud, his face alight with genuine appreciation. "That," he said, "is what Easter music should sound like. Not just celebration, but the whole journey, doubt, struggle, and the dawn of new understanding." Voss stood very still, looking at the choir with an expression that mixed surprise and something close to wonder. For once, the brilliant pianist seemed to have no words, and in that moment of silence, something shifted. A challenge had been issued, a gauntlet thrown down. The stage was now set for whatever would come next. Easter morning dawned clear and bright over Rome. The first golden rays of sun touched the dome of St. Peter's Basilica, making it glow against the pale blue sky. Even at this early hour, crowds were already gathering in the square, eager to secure good spots for the day's celebrations. Inside the Vatican, the atmosphere buzzed with activity. Staff hurried through corridors carrying flowers and ceremonial items. Priests and bishops from around the world prepared for the most important service of the year. And in a small chapel tucked away from the main areas, the choir gathered for final preparations. Sister Angelica moved among them, straightening a collar here, offering an encouraging word there. Her usual calm efficiency was tinged with nervous energy today. "Remember to breathe," she reminded them. "No matter what happens, just breathe and trust your training." Brother Anthony sat at a small piano in the corner, quietly playing through difficult passages, his eyes closed in concentration. Nearby, 2 altar servers practiced the precise movements they would need during the ceremony. The door opened, and Father Thomas peeked in. "It's a full house out there," he reported. "People have been lining up since dawn. Even the overflow areas are filling up." Sister Angelica nodded. "Any sign of Mr. Voss?" "Not yet, but his assistant called to say they're on their way." Just as he finished speaking, the door opened again. Edward Voss entered, dressed in an impeccable black suit with a white shirt so crisp it almost seemed to glow. His face was serious, focused. "Good morning," he said, scanning the room quickly. "Is everyone ready?" Sister Angelica stepped forward. "As ready as we'll ever be. Would you like to give them any final guidance?" Voss hesitated, then moved to stand before the choir. Over the past 2 weeks, he had come to know each of these faces. The older tenor who struggled with the higher notes but sang with such emotion. The young soprano whose voice was technically perfect but sometimes lacked confidence. The bass section leader who had argued passionately with Voss about the tempo of the final movement. "I've conducted and performed in concert halls around the world," he began. "I've played with the finest orchestras, the most prestigious ensembles." He paused, looking at their expectant faces. "But what we've created together these past weeks is different. It's not just about the notes or the technique. It's about what happens when the music becomes something more than sound." The choir members watched him, surprise evident on many faces. This was not the demanding perfectionist they had come to know. "Today, when you stand before thousands of people," Voss continued, "don't think about them. Don't think about me, or even about yourselves. Think about why you're singing, about what these songs mean to you." He smiled slightly. "And remember, if something goes wrong, keep going. Sometimes the unexpected moments are where the real music happens." Sister Angelica's eyes glistened with tears as she stepped forward. "Thank you, Mr. Voss. I think I speak for all of us when I say that working with you has been challenging, illuminating, and ultimately a blessing." A murmur of agreement rippled through the choir. Voss looked momentarily uncomfortable with the sentiment but nodded in acknowledgement. The door opened again, and Cardinal Ricci appeared. "It's time," he announced. "The procession is beginning." The atmosphere immediately shifted to focused anticipation. The choir members gathered their music folders and lined up in their designated order. Sister Angelica gave Voss a quick nod before taking her place at the head of the group. Cardinal Ricci pulled Voss aside as the others filed out. "I trust today's performance will proceed smoothly," he said, his tone making it more command than observation. Voss met his gaze evenly. "Music is never entirely predictable, Cardinal. That's what makes it alive." The Cardinal's mouth tightened, but he said nothing more as they followed the choir toward the basilica. St. Peter's was transformed for Easter. Thousands of white and gold flowers adorned the altar and columns. Sunlight streamed through the windows, catching on gold leaf and creating pools of light on the marble floor. The massive space was filled to capacity, with people standing in every available space. As the choir took their positions, Voss was escorted to a special area near the front, where he would perform his solo later in the service. He glanced up at the choir and caught Sister Angelica's eye. She gave him a small, encouraging smile. The ceremony began with all the pomp and ritual of Vatican tradition. Incense filled the air as elaborately vested priests and bishops processed down the central aisle. When Pope Leo XIV appeared, a reverent hush fell over the assembly, followed by enthusiastic applause. The Pope looked resplendent in gold and white vestments, but his face held the same gentle warmth Voss had come to recognize in their private conversations. As he passed Voss's seat, their eyes met briefly, and the Pope gave an almost imperceptible nod. The first part of the service followed ancient traditions, prayers, readings, and responses that had remained largely unchanged for centuries. When it came time for the first musical selection, Sister Angelica raised her hands, and the choir began one of the traditional Easter hymns they had practiced. Their voices rose pure and clear in the vast space, filling every corner of the basilica with sound. Voss watched with professional interest, noting how well they had adapted to the acoustics of the space. The months of training under his demanding direction showed in their precise entries and carefully balanced harmonies. When they finished, there was a moment of appreciative silence before the service continued. Cardinal Ricci, standing near the altar, looked pleased but not surprised, as if their excellence was expected. The service proceeded through its carefully choreographed movements. Readings in multiple languages reflected the global nature of the Church. Prayers were offered for peace and healing in a troubled world. Through it all, the congregation remained engaged, drawn into the ancient rhythms of worship. Then came time for the Liszt piece, with Brother Anthony at the piano. As the young monk took his place, Voss felt an unexpected flutter of nervousness on his behalf. But as soon as Brother Anthony's fingers touched the keys, it was clear his concerns were unnecessary. The opening notes floated through the basilica with perfect clarity. When the choir joined in, the effect was transcendent. The piece, written during Liszt's time at the Vatican, seemed made for this space and this moment. Voss found himself holding his breath during certain passages, moved despite his usual professional detachment. As the final notes faded, Pope Leo XIV closed his eyes briefly in appreciation. Even Cardinal Ricci looked impressed, nodding slightly to Brother Anthony, who blushed with pleasure as he returned to his place. Now it was Voss's turn. As he rose and moved toward the grand piano that had been positioned near the altar, he felt thousands of eyes following him. This was familiar territory. He had performed for large audiences throughout his career. Yet something felt different today. The stakes seemed higher, more personal. He settled at the piano, took a moment to center himself, and began to play. He had chosen a piece that showcased both technical brilliance and emotional depth, a composition that spoke of searching, questioning, and ultimately finding a kind of peace, if not definitive answers. His fingers moved across the keys with practiced precision, but today he was less concerned with technical perfection than with conveying the heart of the music. He thought of the conversations with Pope Leo, the arguments with Cardinal Ricci, the breakthroughs with the choir. All of it seemed woven into the music now. When he finished, the basilica was completely silent for several heartbeats. Then applause erupted, echoing off the high ceilings and marble columns. Voss acknowledged it with a slight bow before returning to his seat. The service continued, building toward its culmination. And then it was time for the final musical selection, Voss's original composition, performed by the choir with Brother Anthony accompanying. Sister Angelica raised her hands, her face serene but intense with concentration. The choir began the gentle opening, their voices blending in the complex harmonies Voss had written. As the piece developed, building through the sections of questioning and doubt toward resolution, Voss found himself leaning forward slightly, caught up in the performance. They reached the challenging middle section, the part about doubt that had caused so much trouble in rehearsals. For a moment, Voss thought he detected a slight hesitation from the altos. His body tensed involuntarily. But they moved through it smoothly, each voice maintaining its distinct line while blending with the others. The tenors entered exactly on cue, adding another layer to the complex structure. Everything was unfolding exactly as written, almost too perfectly, Voss realized. The notes were all correct, the timing precise, the dynamics carefully observed. Yet somehow something was missing. The raw emotion, the sense of genuine questioning that had emerged during that breakthrough rehearsal was absent. In its place was a technically excellent but somewhat safe performance. Cardinal Ricci, standing near the altar, was smiling slightly, clearly pleased with the polished presentation. But when Voss glanced at Pope Leo, he saw a thoughtful expression, as if the pontiff too sensed that something was missing. As the piece moved toward its conclusion, Voss felt a growing disappointment. Yes, they were performing his music beautifully, but they weren't really performing what the music was about. The questions had been smoothed away, the rough edges polished until they no longer challenged or provoked. When the final notes faded away, enthusiastic applause filled the basilica. The choir members looked relieved and happy, exchanging small smiles of triumph. Sister Angelica gave them a proud nod before turning to acknowledge the congregation's appreciation. Only Voss remained still, his expression thoughtful and slightly troubled. He had gotten what he thought he wanted, a perfect performance of his music in this historic setting. So why did it feel somehow hollow? The service continued with Pope Leo XIV delivering his Easter message. He spoke of renewal and hope, of finding light after darkness and life after death, but he also touched on something unexpected. Easter is not only about certainty, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the basilica. It's also about the journey through doubt and questions. The first witnesses to the resurrection didn't immediately understand what they were seeing. They questioned, they wondered, they doubted, and through that process, they came to a deeper faith than simple acceptance could have given them. Voss found himself listening intently, the Pope's words resonating with his own thoughts about music and meaning. In our world today, the Pope continued, we often seek certainty above all else. We want clear answers, definitive statements, but true growth, both spiritual and artistic, requires us to embrace questions, to move through uncertainty toward a truth that's larger than our understanding. As the Pope concluded his message and the service moved toward its final prayers, Voss noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The formality remained, but there was a more reflective quality to the congregation's participation, as if the Pope's words had invited them to bring their whole selves, doubts included, into this celebration. When the final blessing had been given and the recessional procession began, Voss remained in his seat watching as the Pope, cardinals, and clergy moved slowly down the central aisle. The choir followed, their faces glowing with the satisfaction of a challenging task completed well. Sister Angelica caught his eye as she passed, giving him a questioning look. He responded with a small nod that acknowledged their technical achievement, while holding back his deeper thoughts. As the basilica slowly emptied, Voss sat alone, surrounded by the echoes of music and words, wondering what would happen next. He was scheduled to play one more time at the evening reception, a solo performance for a smaller, more select audience, including dignitaries and special guests. What would he play? The carefully rehearsed piece he had planned, or something else, something that might recapture the raw, questioning quality that had been missing today. As he finally rose to leave, he noticed Pope Leo XIV standing quietly in a side alcove, watching him with that same thoughtful expression. Their eyes met briefly across the distance, and Voss had the unsettling feeling that the pontiff knew exactly what he was thinking. The stage was now set for their final encounter, and for whatever unexpected turn it might take. Evening fell over the Vatican, wrapping the ancient buildings in soft purple shadows. The Easter celebrations had continued throughout the day, with various services and events. But now came the final gathering, an exclusive reception for dignitaries, special guests, and Vatican officials. The reception was held in one of the Vatican's grand halls, a space usually closed to the public. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over marble floors and Renaissance artwork. Servers in formal attire moved among the guests, offering champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres on silver trays. Edward Voss stood alone near a window, watching the mingling crowd. He had changed from his morning suit into an equally elegant evening attire, black with subtle details that spoke of quiet luxury. Several people had approached to compliment his performance, but he had responded with polite brevity, his mind clearly elsewhere. Sister Angelica found him in this contemplative state. She had exchanged her choir director's robes for a simple but formal black dress, her only adornment a small silver cross at her neck. "There you are," she said. "Everyone's been asking about you." Voss gave a small smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Just gathering my thoughts before the performance." She studied his face. "You don't seem entirely pleased with this morning's service. The choir has been celebrating their success all day, but you've been noticeably absent." "They performed admirably," Voss said carefully. Every note was correct, but he turned to look directly at her. "Have you ever achieved exactly what you thought you wanted, only to discover it wasn't what you needed?" Before Sister Angelica could respond, Cardinal Ricci approached them, accompanied by a distinguished-looking man in diplomatic attire. "Ah, Mr. Voss. Allow me to introduce the ambassador from Austria. He's a great admirer of your work." The Cardinal's tone was cordial but carried an undercurrent of command. This was not a conversation Voss could politely avoid. As Voss engaged in the expected pleasantries with the ambassador, Sister Angelica slipped away, moving through the crowd toward the other side of the room where several choir members had gathered. Brother Anthony stood among them, looking somewhat uncomfortable in formal clothes. "Have you spoken with Mr. Voss?" he asked as Sister Angelica joined their group. "He seemed distant when I saw him earlier." "I think he's wrestling with something," she replied. Artists are often their own harshest critics. Across the room, Father Thomas appeared at a small podium that had been set up near a magnificent grand piano, a different instrument than the one used in the morning service. This one a legendary Bosendorfer that had been brought in specially for the evening. "Ladies and gentlemen," Father Thomas announced, his voice carrying easily through the hall, "if you would kindly take your seats, we're honored to present a special performance by our distinguished guest, the renowned pianist Edward Voss." The crowd moved toward rows of elegant chairs arranged facing the piano. Voss made his way to the front, nodding in acknowledgement of the enthusiastic applause that greeted him. At the center of the front row sat Pope Leo XIV, who had changed from his elaborate ceremonial vestments into the simpler white robes he preferred for less formal occasions. His face showed genuine anticipation. Cardinal Ricci leaned toward the Pope. "A fitting conclusion to a most successful Easter celebration, wouldn't you agree, Your Holiness?" "We shall see," the Pope replied mysteriously, his eyes fixed on Voss as the pianist took his position at the keyboard. Voss sat at the piano, taking a moment to adjust the bench. The room fell silent in expectation. Everyone knew his reputation for technical brilliance and emotional control. They anticipated a performance that would showcase his virtuosity, perhaps one of his famous interpretations of Chopin or Rachmaninoff. But as his hands hovered over the keys, Voss still hadn't decided what to play. The piece he had planned and rehearsed seemed suddenly inadequate, a safe choice that would certainly impress but would say nothing of what he had experienced these past weeks. He glanced up and found Pope Leo watching him with that same thoughtful expression from earlier. In that moment, something shifted inside him. Without announcing his selection, Voss began to play, not the dramatic showpiece he had prepared, but something simpler. He started with a single note, middle C, letting it resonate through the hall, feeling its vibration under his fingers. From that single note, he began to build, adding harmonies, developing a melody that seemed to form itself under his hands. He was improvising, something he rarely did in public performances where precision and control were his trademarks. The audience exchanged glances of surprise. This was not what they had expected from the famous pianist known for his technically perfect interpretations of classical masterworks. As the improvisation continued, Voss incorporated fragments of the music from the morning service, a hint of the traditional hymn, a brief passage from the Liszt piece, and then themes from his own composition. But he transformed them, exploring the spaces between the notes, the questions behind the harmonies. His playing became increasingly complex and passionate, pushing beyond the careful boundaries he usually maintained. There were moments of dissonance that resolved into unexpected harmony, passages of doubt that evolved into statements of cautious hope. The audience sat spellbound. Even Cardinal Ricci, who had begun with a slight frown of confusion, now leaned forward in his seat, caught up in the unfolding musical journey. Sister Angelica watched with tears in her eyes, recognizing the emotional truth that had been missing from the morning's technically perfect performance. This was music that asked real questions, that wasn't afraid of uncertainty or doubt. After nearly 15 minutes of this extraordinary musical exploration, Voss began to bring the piece to a close, gradually simplifying the harmonies, slowing the tempo, returning almost to where he had begun, but not quite. The final chord contained both resolution and openness, a musical question mark that hung in the air as his hands lifted from the keys. For several seconds, the hall remained completely silent. Then Pope Leo XIV stood and began to applaud. The rest of the audience followed, rising to their feet in a spontaneous standing ovation. The applause continued, growing rather than diminishing, with murmurs of amazement spreading through the crowd. But Voss hardly seemed to notice. He remained seated at the piano, his head slightly bowed, as if still caught in the world of the music he had created. When the applause finally began to subside, Pope Leo XIV approached the piano. This wasn't part of the planned program, and Cardinal Ricci made a small movement as if to intervene, then thought better of it. "Mr. Voss," the Pope said, his voice carrying clearly through the now quiet hall. "That was extraordinary. Would you mind if I asked you something?" Voss looked up, his expression still vulnerable from the emotional journey of his performance. "Of course, Your Holiness. What you just played, it wasn't prepared in advance, was it?" Voss shook his head. No, it was a conversation of sorts. With the music, with this place, with these past weeks, the Pope nodded. That's what I thought. He turned slightly to address the audience while remaining near the piano. We've all been privileged to witness something rare tonight. Not just extraordinary skill, but genuine artistic courage. He turned back to Voss. May I? He asked, gesturing toward the piano. Surprised, Voss moved slightly to make room on the bench. The Pope sat beside him and placed his right hand on the keyboard. With one finger he pressed middle C, the same note Voss had begun with. As the single note resonated through the hall, Pope Leo looked out at the audience. Music, like faith, he said, requires both precision and soul. Technical perfection alone can leave us cold. Soul without discipline can become shapeless emotion. He pressed the note again, letting it sound. This simple note, when played with love, contains the universe. The mathematician hears frequencies and ratios. The poet hears the beginning of a story. The physicist hears vibrating molecules. The believer hears the voice of God. He smiled. All of these perspectives contain truth, yet none holds the complete truth alone. Voss stared at the Pope, completely still, absorbing his words. Mr. Voss, the Pope continued, your morning performance showed us your remarkable technical mastery. But tonight you showed us your soul, with all its questions, doubts, and hopes. That is the greater gift. He turned to face Voss directly. In doing so, you've taught us something about Easter that all my sermons could not express so eloquently. That the journey through doubt and darkness is not a detour from faith, but often the path to its deepest expression. The hall was utterly silent now, everyone transfixed by this unexpected exchange. Would you play something with me? The Pope asked, surprising everyone again. Something simple. Perhaps the Bach prelude we discussed last week. Voss nodded, still seemingly unable to speak. Together they began to play, the Pope taking the simple, meditative melody while Voss provided a gentle accompaniment. It wasn't technically complex, but the sight and sound of these two very different men, finding harmony together, created a moment of profound beauty. When they finished, the audience remained silent for several heartbeats before erupting into applause even more enthusiastic than before. Many had tears in their eyes, moved by what they had witnessed. As they stood to acknowledge the applause, the Pope whispered something to Voss that no one else could hear. Whatever it was made the pianist's expression change from stunned to thoughtful, and finally to something approaching peace. Later that evening, after the reception had ended and most guests had departed, Sister Angelica found Voss sitting alone in the now empty hall, still at the piano though no longer playing. That was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard, she said simply. Voss looked up, his usual mask of confident professionalism completely gone. I didn't know I had that in me, he admitted. All these years I've been so focused on playing the notes perfectly that I forgot why I started playing in the first place. What did the Holy Father say to you at the end? She asked. If you don't mind my asking. Voss smiled, a real smile that transformed his face. He said, sometimes we have to forget what we know to remember what we believe. Sister Angelica nodded. Wise words. I've been invited to return next year, Voss said, sounding slightly amazed. Not just to perform, but to compose something new for Easter, a piece about faith and doubt, questions and answers. Will you accept? He ran his fingers lightly over the keys without pressing them down. I think I will. I have some new questions I want to explore. As they walked together toward the door, Voss paused to look back at the piano where his unexpected musical journey had unfolded. I came here thinking I would show the church something about music, he said quietly. Instead, the church and its remarkable Pope showed me something about myself. Outside, the Easter moon hung low and golden over the Vatican, casting long shadows across the ancient stones. In the basilica nearby, a single candle still burned in the darkness, a small light holding back the night. Much like the fragile, persistent flame of hope that can survive even the darkest doubts. And in the quiet emptiness of St. Peter's Square, the echo of a single piano note, middle C, seemed to linger, a question and an answer all at once.